She spent 23 years hunting her husband's killer from inside the same building where the killer clocked in every morning. Because the detective who murdered Sherry Rasmussen wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was wearing a badge. She was answering phones down the hall from the men investigating her own crime. And for 23 years, she smiled at them in the break room. We are not going to tell you her name yet. Not until you understand exactly what she took and exactly how long she got away with it. Here's what should terrify you about this story. It isn't the murder. It's the 23 years of silence that came after it. A father who knew the killer's name from day one. A police department that had that name written down, typed up, filed away, and did nothing. A woman who bit into her victim's arm during a struggle for her life, and then went back to work Monday morning in an LAPD uniform, and nobody blinked. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a decorated police detective committed a murder in broad daylight, hid in plain sight inside her own department for over 2 decades, and was only caught because of a torn envelope sitting in a forgotten freezer. You'll meet the father who refused to stop asking questions even when the police told him, word for word, that he was watching too much television. And you'll meet the one person inside LAPD who found the truth and was punished for it. If you're new here, welcome. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from. And if true crime stories like this one keep you up at night in the best way, hit subscribe now. Because we cover cases like this every week. Cold cases, cover-ups, killers hiding in the last place anyone would think to look. Stay with us to the end, because the final 20 minutes of this story will change how you see the phrase protect and serve. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the blood, before the badge, before any of it. Sherry Rasmussen was born in February of 1957, the middle daughter of 3. She was the kind of smart kid that skips grades. By 16, she was already in college, years ahead of everyone around her. Her father, Nels, quietly hoped she'd become a doctor. Sherry had other plans. She chose nursing because she wanted a life that let her care for people and still have a family of her own. By 23, she had a master's degree and was teaching at UCLA. By her late 20s, she was running the nursing department at a major Los Angeles hospital, the youngest woman to ever hold that position. She still found time to teach. She still remembered every patient's name. Coworkers said she was the person you wanted standing over you on the worst night of your life. Her sister put it simply, Sherry was the family's anchor, the one who made everyone believe things were going to be okay. In the summer of 1984, at a party she almost didn't go to, Sherry met a computer engineer named John Rutan. He would later say he was drawn to her the second he saw her laugh from across the room. They dated. They fell in love. In November of 1985, they got married. But John brought something into that marriage he never fully told Sherry about. A woman from his past who had not let go. A woman who did not accept that he had chosen someone else. A woman who, at that very moment, was working as a Los Angeles police officer. Here's the part that will sit with you long after this video ends. Sherry knew she was in danger. She wasn't blindsided. She had looked her husband's ex in the eye. She had told her own father she was afraid. She said the words out loud, to the people who loved her, in the weeks before she died. Nobody acted fast enough to save her. February 24th, 1986 started like any ordinary Monday. Sherry stayed home. John left for work at 7:20 in the morning, glancing back at his wife, still half asleep in bed. It was the last time he'd ever see her alive. He forgot to arm the alarm. He was never sure if he'd locked the door, a detail that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A neighbor noticed the garage was still closed at 8:30 that morning. By 9:30, it was open, and Sherry's new BMW was gone. Detectives would later narrow the time of death to that exact window, 8:30 to 10 a.m., a quiet stretch of a quiet Monday when nobody on that street was watching. John came home that evening to an open garage and an empty parking spot where his wife's car should have been. Strange, but not impossible. Sherry ran a hospital department. Emergencies happened. He climbed the stairs. The front door was slightly open. He pushed it in, and there she was, on the living room floor, in a pool of blood. He called 911 with a voice that didn't sound like his own. Detective Lyle Mayer arrived that night, and within minutes, not hours, minutes, he had already made up his mind about what happened. He looked at the electronics stacked by the door, the missing wallet, the missing car, and told John, almost casually, "I believe your house was burglarized this morning." He said it like he was reading a weather report. But that's not even the worst part. Other officers on scene that same night noticed the front door had no prime marks. No forced entry. Someone had opened that door from the inside. Or Sherry had opened it herself, for someone she recognized. That detail should have stopped the burglary theory in its tracks. It didn't. Nobody adjusted course. The story had already been written in Meyer's head, and everyone else simply followed it. One of the first paramedics on scene lifted the blanket covering Sherry's face and said quietly, "This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was something else entirely." Because here's what the crime scene actually told them, if anyone had been willing to listen. Sherry didn't die quickly. She fought. She fought hard. A vase in the living room lay shattered. The butt of a gun had struck her face. Not once, but at least twice. Hard enough to blacken both eyes and shatter the glasses off her face. Deep scratch marks were carved into the front door, the last frantic evidence of a woman clawing for a way out that never came. She was shot 3 times in the chest with a .38 caliber revolver, through a pillow, pressed close enough to muffle the sound so the neighbors would hear nothing. And on her left arm, a deep, unmistakable bite mark. Not a stray injury. A bite. The kind that only happens in a face-to-face, hand-to-hand fight over a weapon. 2 of her fingernails were snapped clean off. She had been bound at some point during the struggle. A forensic technician swabbed that bite mark that same night, sealed it, and placed it in a freezer. Routine procedure. Nobody in that room understood, in that moment, that this single swab would still exist 23 years later, and that it would be the one piece of evidence Sherry's killer could never explain away. Meanwhile, the electronics by the door, the ones Mayer pointed to as proof of burglary, were stacked. Neatly. Not scattered in a panic, not ransacked the way real burglars leave a house. Stacked. Like someone had carefully arranged them after everything else was already over. Sherry's wallet and car were gone. So was the couple's marriage certificate. A strange thing for a burglar to take. But every piece of jewelry in that apartment, diamond rings, gold chains worth thousands, was left untouched. No burglar in the history of burglars walks past diamonds to steal a marriage certificate. Nobody questioned it. Mayer had already decided he was, in his own words, a good judge of character. And he ruled out John almost on sight. Despite John sitting at the dining table that night, crying in a way one first responder later described as strangely restrained for a man who'd just found his wife murdered. 5 weeks later, 2 men broke into a house less than a mile away, were surprised by the homeowner, and fled. Witnesses described 2 young Hispanic men, one armed. And just like that, LAPD had their explanation, wrapped up with a bow. Same neighborhood. Similar time frame. Similar weapon type. The burglary theory hardened into fact. Those 2 men were never found. And their shadows would protect Sherry's real killer for over 2 decades. When Sherry's father Nels learned his daughter was dead, he didn't hear it from John. He heard it through John's own father. And when Nels asked to speak to his son-in-law directly, the answer came back cold. John doesn't want to talk. At the police station, John avoided the family entirely, claiming the police wouldn't allow contact. Nels remembered thinking something was wrong with that. John seemed more worried about himself than about his murdered wife. After the funeral, John left Los Angeles and never came back. Nels did the opposite. He stayed. He talked. He told police everything Sherry had confided in him, about a woman, an LAPD officer, John's ex, who had stalked and threatened her in the months before her death. A woman named Stephanie Lazarus. Meyer's response has echoed through this family for 4 decades. There's nothing there, he told Nels. And then, looking a grieving father dead in the eye, "You're watching too much television." That sentence would haunt the Rasmussen family for the next 23 years. Sherry's BMW turned up 11 days later, 3 kilometers away, wiped clean of prints. Her wallet, also wiped. And then, silence. A silence that would stretch on for 2 full decades. But Nels never stopped. A year after the murder, he stood in front of cameras and demanded action. He wrote directly to the LAPD chief of police, naming Lazarus by name. In 1988, Sherry's sister reached out to true crime author and Rule, hoping a book might force the case back into the light. Rule got as far as asking a retired detective to quietly look into the Lazarus angle. Days later, the message came back. This case is too hot to touch. The book was never written. And Stephanie Lazarus kept walking into that building every single morning. Same hallway. Same organization. The murder file with Sherry's name on it sat quietly in storage, gathering dust, while the woman who put it there climbed the ranks around it. In 1991, Mayer retired, and the file passed to a new detective who told the Rasmussen family flatly that he saw no new leads worth chasing. Nels flew from Tucson to Los Angeles to hear those words in person. He would make that same flight, over and over, for years, sitting across from a rotating cast of detectives, each one holding the same thin file, each one sending him home with nothing. Every meeting felt less like an investigation and more like a performance stage to make a grieving father stop asking questions. In 1993, Nels read about a new technology called DNA testing and thought, finally, here's a way to get real answers. He offered to pay for it himself. All he needed was permission to test evidence that had been sitting untouched in storage for 7 years. He was told no. Police need a suspect before they test evidence, they said. He'd had a suspect since 1986. Nobody would listen. And then something happened that no one in the Rasmussen family could ever fully explain. Pieces of the murder file began disappearing. Someone, at some point, physically cut the file in half, the official explanation being that the cold case archive had run out of shelf space. Half of a 23-year-old murder investigation, gone, because of a storage problem. In 1997, a small crack of light appeared. A former hospital coworker came forward with a memory. Lazarus had shown up at Sherry's office in January of 1986, weeks before the murder, and confronted her face to face. The coworker had told a colleague about it the very same day it happened. This was a live witness, with a live memory, describing exactly the kind of behavior that should have put Lazarus at the center of the investigation. Nobody followed up. 3 years later, that witness died, and her first-hand account died with her. While all of this was happening, while a father begged, while a witness came forward and was ignored, while evidence physically vanished from a filing cabinet, Stephanie Lazarus was climbing. In the 90s, she worked in LAPD's personnel department, the exact division that handled sensitive information on officers and suspects. From that desk, she would have known, at any moment, whether her own name had surfaced anywhere in an active investigation. A colleague later recalled something chilling. Lazarus once mentioned, almost in passing, in an ordinary office conversation, that she'd been questioned as part of an investigation into an ex-boyfriend's missing wife, a wife who may have been shot. She said it like small talk. Nobody in that room thought twice about it. She made detective. She was profiled in the news. She was even mentioned in books about the city's art underground. Prosecutors would later describe her, almost affectionately, as a solid but unremarkable cop. Not brilliant, not incompetent, just forgettable enough to disappear inside her own department for 23 years. Her office sat just down the hallway from the detectives working Sherry's case. Now here's a detail that, on its own, means nothing. But wait until you see where it leads. 2 weeks after Sherry's murder, Lazarus reported her backup .38 caliber handgun missing, but she reported it to a different police department entirely, not her own. She never filed the required internal LAPD report. 1 month later, she bought a replacement gun and registered that one properly, right through LAPD. Like nothing had happened. 2 files. 2 separate agencies. Nobody put them side by side for 23 years. In 2001, LAPD finally created a cold case unit to tackle over 9,000 unsolved murders stretching back decades. Sherry's file, now 15 years old, didn't land on the desk of a seasoned homicide detective. It landed with a criminalist, a crime scene analyst, not an investigator, named Jennifer Francis. Francis started from page 1. She read every document in that file herself, and she found something the previous 4 detectives had somehow missed entirely. The notes on the bite mark said investigators had recovered only 1 blood type from that swab, implying it might have come from Sherry biting herself. Francis knew immediately that this made no biological sense. A bite mark produces 2 DNA profiles, one from the person bitten, one from the person who did the biting. So where was the actual swab? It wasn't in the evidence locker. Francis spent hours on the phone, calling every forensics lab in the city, describing what she was looking for, getting nothing but dead ends. Then, after 6 straight hours, a coroner at the county morgue said 3 words that would crack this case wide open. I found something. A torn, barely legible envelope, sitting in a freezer. since 1986. Inside it, a small glass vial. Intact. Preserved. 15 years old and still viable. She sent it for testing immediately. Female DNA. Not Sherry's. Another woman's DNA, pulled from the bite mark left in Sherry Rasmussen's arm during the fight for her life. Frances went back through every letter Nels had ever written, every meeting, every dismissed tip, and Lazarus's name kept appearing again and again, always noted, never chased down. A theory started forming in her mind that she almost didn't want to believe. The obsessive ex-girlfriend. The bite mark. The same person. She took her findings to the cold case unit. Ignored. To the scientific division. Ignored. To robbery homicide. Ignored. To internal affairs. And this is where things take a dark turn. Because that time, instead of being ignored, she was attacked. Her superiors didn't examine the evidence. They examined her. They questioned her mental state. Called her too emotional. Obsessed. Paranoid. She was ordered into mandatory counseling with an LAPD-appointed therapist, a decision that quietly branded her as unstable, unfit to be trusted with major cases. But here's what really shook Jennifer Frances. It wasn't the therapy sessions themselves. It was what happened inside them. The therapist never once asked about her well-being. Every question was about the case. Who had she talked to? What had she shared? With whom? And how much? This wasn't counseling. It was an interrogation wearing a lab coat. A deputy district attorney called her crazy to her face. Colleagues told her, openly, to find a new hobby. She was quietly pulled off major cases and buried in paperwork nobody else wanted. Jennifer Frances was walking the exact same road Nels Rasmussen had walked for 15 years before her. The only two people who saw the truth clearly, both crushed, in different ways, by the same machine. That same year, a detective named Cliff Shepard independently pulled the bite mark file and ordered his own DNA test. His results matched Frances's exactly. Female DNA. Not what I expected, he said quietly. And just like that, 15 years of burglary theory collapsed. Male intruders don't bite during a robbery. Someone had fought Sherry Rasmussen, face to face, close enough to sink teeth into her arm. The question was no longer who broke into that apartment. The question was which woman had killed her. To understand what happened, you have to go back further. Lazarus and John Ruetten met at UCLA in the late 70s. To him, it was casual. He dated other people. He never thought of her as a real girlfriend. To her, it was the love of her life. That gap, two people living in completely different versions of the same relationship, is the crack that everything else grew out of. And her obsession wasn't subtle, even back then. John later told detectives that while they were both still living in the dorms, Lazarus had stolen his underwear and snuck into his room to photograph him while he slept. He knew about it, and he kept the relationship going anyway, kept sleeping with her even after he proposed to Sherry, telling himself he just didn't want to hurt her feelings. Every time he chose comfort over honesty, he poured gasoline on something that was already burning. In August of 1985, as word of the engagement spread, Lazarus wrote to her own mother, "I really love John, and this past year has torn me apart. I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." She did not accept that decision. Between June and August of 1985, she started showing up at Sherry's hospital during working hours, dressed deliberately, short shorts, a tight tank top, and walked straight into Sherry's office to say it to her face. "John and I are still sleeping together. And when your marriage falls apart, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Sherry didn't flinch. "Your services won't be needed," she said. Lazarus's parting words were colder than anything that came before. "If I can't have John, no one else will have him. Not even you." She started showing up at their apartment. One morning, after John left for work, Sherry opened her own front door and found Lazarus standing inside her living room, wearing her LAPD uniform. Sherry told her to leave. She left. It didn't stop there. Sherry was followed at least 5 times in a single week. The same face at the grocery store. The same face at the gym. The same face on streets she walked every day. She told her father the woman following her had eyes that seemed to look straight through you. 3 weeks before she died, Sherry sat with her father in Tucson and told him she was afraid. Afraid this woman was tracking her, sometimes disguising herself, dressing like a young man to move through the city unnoticed. She never gave her father the stalker's name. It's one of the family's deepest regrets, a small missing piece that might have changed everything. On Valentine's Day, 1986, Lazarus's roommate moved out. For the first time, she was living completely alone. 1 week later, an old college friend of John's visited the apartment. The next morning, Sherry Rasmussen was dead. By November of 2009, 23 years after that morning, a robbery-homicide detective named James Nuttall finally called Jennifer Francis. She had waited 5 years for that phone call, and she was almost afraid of it, because everything she'd lived through had taught her one brutal lesson. Not everyone inside that building actually wanted the truth. She told Nuttall she didn't believe this was ever a burglary. She hinted the evidence might have been tampered with, but she held back. She didn't name Lazarus outright. She'd learned to be careful about how much truth she handed to people she didn't yet trust. She didn't need to say the name. Nuttall already had the DNA results in front of him. He read through decades of Nels's letters. He saw Lazarus's name surface again and again, dismissed again and again. He went back to Meyer's original 1986 interview with John and realized, with growing unease, that the entire case had been built on a conclusion reached in the first 5 minutes and never once revisited. And then he noticed something that should have happened on day one and never had. In 23 years, not one of the 3 detectives who'd inherited this file had ever gone back and done a proper second interview with John Rutan, the one man alive who knew the full story about Lazarus. Nuttall built a circle of trust so small it barely existed on paper. Just himself, Francis, and 3 detectives he was certain he could rely on. Their goal: prove that one of their own had committed this murder, without tipping off the department itself. Before anything else, they needed John. He'd relocated to the Bay Area, remarried, built a new life, a new family. Nuttall found him and interviewed him with a bluntness nobody had used in over 2 decades. He asked directly about the ex-girlfriend. He didn't flinch from the uncomfortable parts. And John finally told the whole story. Not fragments this time, everything. The hospital confrontation, the uniform in the living room, the stalking. And, for the first time, John admitted something he'd never said out loud to police before. While engaged to Sherry, he had kept sleeping with Lazarus, fully aware of how obsessed she was, and still hadn't cut it off cleanly. The family would later say it plainly. He wasn't honest with her. Instead of ending it, he just let it drag on. That isn't how a husband who loves his wife behaves. Now Nuttall had a name, a motive, a history stretching back a decade. But this wasn't a normal suspect. This was a fellow officer, working in the same building, with access to the exact systems that could tip her off in seconds. He couldn't request her DNA without airtight justification. She'd have every legal right to refuse. And the request itself would blow the entire operation wide open. He couldn't question her directly, because the moment she knew, she could warn people, destroy evidence, disappear. So they went silent. A secret surveillance team, completely off the books, left no trace anywhere in the department's normal paperwork. For weeks, they followed Stephanie Lazarus. To work, home, the grocery store, waiting. And then, one ordinary afternoon, at a convenience store, Lazarus bought a drink, finished it, and threw the empty cup in a public trash can. The surveillance team retrieved it within minutes. The saliva on that rim went straight to Jennifer Francis. She compared it to the swab that had been sitting in a freezer since February of 1986. The swab she had spent 6 hours hunting for. The swab that had outlived 3 detectives. A cut-in-half file and 23 years of institutional silence. It was a perfect match. The woman who bit Sherry Rasmussen while fighting for her life in 1986 was Stephanie Lazarus. On June 5, 2009, Nuttall set the trap. Lazarus was told her help was needed with a difficult suspect interview, and led into the one room in the entire LAPD building where no weapons were allowed, the suspect interview room. She walked in with absolutely no idea she was the suspect. At first, she said she barely remembered Sherry Rasmussen at all. When pressed, she softened it slightly. Maybe she'd spoken to her once or twice. When the questions sharpened further, her voice sharpened too. "Are you accusing me of this? This is ridiculous." She asked for a lawyer. She stood up. And the moment she stepped out of that room, 23 years of freedom ended. She was placed under arrest on the spot. The news moved through the building like electricity. Officers who had worked beside her for over 2 decades stood frozen in the hallway. unable to process what they were hearing about one of their own. The trial opened in February of 2012, 26 years after John Rueten's shaking voice first called 911 from that apartment in Van Nuys. It became one of the most closely watched trials in LAPD's history, not only because of how brutal the murder had been, but because the woman sitting at the defense table had once worn the exact same uniform as the people prosecuting her. Lazarus pleaded not guilty. She never took the stand. For 3 straight weeks, she sat in near total silence, her expression giving away nothing. The prosecutor opened with a single line that captured the entire 23-year nightmare: 1 bite, 1 bullet, 1 gun barrel, and 1 broken heart. The investigation had taken 4 months to complete. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury needed less than a single day to decide. Layer by layer, the state built a case with no gaps left for the defense to slip through. The DNA from the bite mark, preserved since 1986, matched perfectly to the saliva off a discarded cup. The missing .38 caliber handgun, reported to the wrong department, replaced a month later through the right one. 2 records, in 2 separate systems, finally placed side by side after 23 years apart. Personal journals, in Lazarus's own handwriting, documenting the depth of an obsession that never faded. John Rueten, on the stand, crying as he repeated Lazarus's own words back to the courtroom. "If I can't have him, no one will." And when asked how he felt about all of it, he said something that silenced the room. "The fact that Sherry died because she loved and married me brings me to my knees." Then came the crime scene itself, dismantled piece by piece in front of the jury. No pry marks on that door, despite what Mayer had insisted from the very first night. Electronics stacked neatly, not scattered by panic. A marriage certificate missing while diamond rings sat untouched. Jennifer Francis took the stand and described, in careful, controlled detail, exactly what happened to her when she tried to hand this truth to the people who were supposed to want it. The accusations, the forced counseling, the interrogation disguised as therapy. And then Nels Rasmussen rose and delivered, finally, in open court, the warning nobody had been willing to hear in 1986. The defense fought hard. They leaned on the old burglary theory, pointed to the break-in nearby as proof the original police work hadn't been baseless. They attacked the integrity of a 15-year-old evidence envelope. They argued that a .38 was the most common service weapon on the entire force, so the gun proved nothing on its own. None of it was enough. After deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty of first-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life, sent to the California Institution for Women. She was permitted to retire from LAPD after her arrest, and to this day, continues to collect her LAPD pension from inside prison. That single fact is something the Rasmussen family has never been able to make peace with. Nels and his wife lived long enough to hear that sentence read aloud. They died still holding the one question that was never answered. Why did it take 23 years? Sherry's sister described the moment the verdict came down as a slow wave of relief. Not celebration, just relief, finally, for a father who'd spent half his life demanding to be believed. At that 2012 trial, John Rueten sat on the stand and cried, carrying the full weight of a truth he'd known for decades and never had the courage to say out loud sooner. He admitted that continuing to sleep with Lazarus after his engagement was a mistake, a word that could never come close to covering what it cost. In 2024, at a parole hearing, he stood in front of the board and said it plainly. She lied for decades, until parole was her only remaining option. Sherry's parents lost their daughter because Sherry loved and married me. That pain never gets smaller. Nels lived to see Lazarus in handcuffs. He lived to hear the guilty verdict. But he died without ever hearing why. Why his warnings, given from the very first week, were buried for 23 years. Why Lazarus's name sat written in a file, over and over, and was never once seriously chased. Before he passed, Nels recorded a video statement to be played at every future parole hearing, for as long as it takes. Looking directly into the camera, he said something that still lands like a punch. "If you look at the damage done to my daughter's face, it looks like she wanted to destroy the beauty Sherry carried." That statement was played in 2023. It will be played again at every hearing that follows. A dead father's voice, still standing guard over his daughter, refusing to let this end quietly. Sherry's memory didn't stay locked inside a courtroom. It lives on in small, quiet ways. Her niece became a nurse because of the aunt she never got to meet, growing up on stories about how Sherry used to love the hardest cardiac cases. Another young relative wore Sherry's own wedding dress on her wedding day, carrying a piece of a woman she never knew. On the most important day of her own life. From behind bars, Lazarus kept fighting. In 2023, for the very first time since her 2009 arrest, she admitted to killing Sherry, not out of remorse, but because a parole board required it. The confession came 37 years after the murder itself. "I'm sick to this day," she said, "that I swore to protect and serve people, and I took Sherry Rasmussen's life." In November of 2023, a parole board initially leaned toward releasing her, a decision reversed only after fierce public pushback from the Rasmussen family, from John Rutan, and from the wider public. In February of 2025, a new hearing ended the same way it should have, denied. One commissioner put it bluntly, "Your account of that 1986 attack doesn't match the evidence. You alone committed this act of extreme violence." As of now, in 2026, Stephanie Lazarus, in her 60s, remains locked inside the California Institution for Women. And the Rasmussen family still lives with the knowledge that the woman who murdered their daughter continues, every single month, to collect a pension from the same department she once used as cover. This case is still taught in criminal investigation courses today. Not because of the DNA, not even because the killer wore a badge. It's taught because of something far more unsettling. A detective walked into that apartment, made up his mind in the first 5 minutes. And every single person who touched that file afterwards simply followed the story he'd already decided was true, instead of questioning it. When a grieving father gave them a name, the answer was there's nothing there. When he offered to personally pay for DNA testing 7 years later, the answer was we need a suspect first. The right name had been sitting in that file since 1986, handed over freely by two people who loved her father and her husband, and for 23 years, nobody wanted to look directly at it. And there's a smaller lesson buried inside this one. Quieter, but just as important. A forensic technician, on the very first night, swabbed a bite mark and placed it in a freezer, simply because that was procedure. Nobody in that room understood what they were preserving. But it's the only reason this case was ever solved. If that swab had been thrown away, if that envelope had been lost, if that freezer had been cleared out during some routine cleanup, Stephanie Lazarus would still be free today. The Rasmussen family eventually sued LAPD. The case was dismissed on a statute of limitations. And Sherry's killer still receives her pension, in prison, to this day. If this story got under your skin the way it got under ours, that's exactly why we make these videos. Every name buried in a cold case file deserves to be spoken again, out loud, by someone who refuses to let it stay forgotten. If you want more stories like this one, the ones that expose what happens when the people meant to protect us look the other way, hit subscribe and join our community using the link in the description below, where we go even deeper into cases just like this one. Thank you for staying until the very last second of this story. Sherry Rasmussen waited 23 years to be heard. We'll see you in the next one.